Hello, and thank you for joining me for a discussion of changes made to existing Maryland Realtors forms for 2019. If you want to hear a discussion of the new forms, please watch the new forms for 2019 video. Also, there were corrections and minor technical changes made. For details about those, please review the 2019 Summary of Changes and Practice Tips document, which is posted on the Maryland Realtors website. I'll start with the residential contract of sale. There are not very many substantive changes to the contracts this year. I'll go in order, beginning with paragraph 13, which is the inclusions/exclusions provision. The item wall mount TV brackets was added to the list, and 2 additional lines were added to the bottom of this provision. In paragraph 24, the settlement cost provision, the sentence buyer broker flat fee cannot be charged to buyer or to seller, with a citation to the regulation 38, Federal Regulation 36.4313B was added. In paragraph 41, the property insurance brochure provision, language was included alerting the parties that the brochure is available on the Maryland Realtors website. In paragraph 42A, which is the flood insurance premium provision, we added an additional sentence that states that the only requirement for purchasing flood insurance from NFIP is that you live in a community that participates in NFIP. That's it for the changes to the contract, and of course, those same changes were made to the unimproved land contract. So let's talk about the escrow agreement between buyer, seller, and escrow agent. Paragraphs 1 and 2 were reordered, so now paragraph 1 is the buyer selection of escrow agent provision. No substantive changes were made. In paragraph 2, which is now the deposit paragraph, the definition of the term deposit was revised so it aligns with how that term is defined in section 10802 of the Real Property Article of the Annotated Code of Maryland. Now, deposit as used in the agreement means deposit, an additional deposit, or a down payment made by a buyer that the buyer entrusts to an escrow agent to hold for the benefit of the owner or beneficial owner of the trust money, and a purpose that relates to the purchase or sale of residential real estate in the state of Maryland. The rationale for this change was for the parties to be able to use the escrow agreement with any contract. The final change was to move the signature line for the escrow agent up so that it's closer to the buyers and sellers' signature lines. In the sale, financing, settlement, or lease of other real estate addendum, a clarification was made to specify that the buyer's property must be listed as active in the MLS. Moving on to the property inspections addendum, in paragraph 1, which is the scope and limitations of inspections provision, the word price was removed. And in paragraph 5, which is the repair, correction, and reinspection provision, the phrase "and provides receipts" was added. Practice tip. Bearing in mind the scope of repairs, the following 2 sentences do hold weight. The first is, the future condition and performance of the above systems and components are not warranted by the seller and are not to be considered subject to this addendum. The second is this sentence. This addendum and the inspections provided herein is not for the purpose of making items of a routine, maintenance, and/or cosmetic nature the subject of further negotiations between the buyer and seller. If you have any questions about this language or any other provision, please call the legal hotline. I'll go on to discuss the changes to the property inspections notice, top of page 1. The sentence, buyer requests that seller provide any receipts or invoices for work done if applicable, was removed. Additionally, the sentence, The inspections provided herein are not for the purpose of making items of a routine maintenance and/or cosmetic nature the subject of further negotiations between buyer and seller was added. Here's a practice tip. This language already appears in the property inspections addendum and is binding on the parties, and serves as a reminder to buyers of the scope of the repair requests they can make. In paragraph 3 of the property inspections notice, which is the response from seller to buyer provision, the phrase check 1 was removed and the phrase check either A, B, or C below, and if applicable, D below was added. In paragraph 4, which is the response from buyer to seller, the phrase check 1 was removed and the phrase check all that apply was added. The only other change to paragraph 4 was the addition of the word and to paragraph 4B and the reordering of paragraphs 4B and 4C. Regarding changes to the residential dwelling lease template, in paragraph 10, which is the active military duty provision, the language was modified so it aligns more closely with the Service Members Civil Relief Act and Section 8212.1 of the Real Property Article, Annotated Code of Maryland. Let's talk about the release of deposit agreement. This is now a standalone form. Note the substance of the form is the same. Here's a practice tip. Terminating the contract and dealing with the deposit are two separate issues. My second tip is this: if the parties use the Maryland Realtors contract and they can't agree on who gets the deposit, they must mediate the dispute before filing a legal claim. Information about mediation is on the Maryland Realtors website under the Legal tab. You might be wondering if there were any changes to the mutual release of obligation under contract. The answer is yes. That's now a standalone form. Very minor stylistic changes were made. Similarly, the unilateral notice of termination is now a standalone form. Once again, very minor technical changes were made. Okay, we are moving on to talk about the exclusive right to sell residential brokerage agreement. Changes were made to paragraph 10, which is the provision that discusses home security systems that record audio. A link was added to the section of the Maryland Code that describes the penalties for violating the law, which range from a fine, imprisonment, or both. Additionally, the seller must now initial that they read and understand that provision. Here's my tip. Our interpretation of the law on this is in order to record someone, you must have their consent. Posting a notice is not sufficient. In paragraph 18, which is the smoke alarm notice, we clarified the language. My tip is if you have additional questions about the smoke alarm law, take a look at the infographic. For more detailed information, read the FAQ. Both are on the website. Finally, in paragraph 32 of the agreement, which lists all the addenda, the Maryland Lead Poisoning Prevention Program disclosure was added to the list. Tip. In a sales transaction, if the property was constructed prior to 1978, the seller is advised to provide both the federal lead disclosure and the Maryland Lead Poisoning Prevention Program disclosure in case the buyer decides to rent out the property. Note, these same changes were made to the exclusive right to lease residential brokerage agreement with the exception of the change to paragraph 32. Notwithstanding, there are state lead requirements rental owners must comply with. Let's look at the inclusions/exclusions addendum to the exclusive right to sell residential brokerage agreement. Here, the item wall mount TV brackets was added to the list to be consistent with the inclusions/exclusions provision in the contract. Regarding the notice to buyers and sellers of residential real estate in Maryland, The provision discussing smoke alarms was modified to be consistent with the changes made in the listing agreements. Here's my tip. When representing a buyer, have them sign the exclusive buyer representation agreement and include this notice. Finally, the notice to consumers regarding licensing status of home improvement contractors was revised to include a line where you can insert the date the home improvement contractor's license expires. There you have it. This concludes my discussion of changes to Maryland Realtors forms for 2019. If you have any questions whatsoever, please contact the Maryland Realtors Legal Hotline. Thank you very much for tuning in.